Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about Japanese vocabulary, and we're going to look at some of the problems it presents and how we can overcome many of them. As I've said before, Japanese is not inherently a difficult language. It's much simpler and more logical in structure than most languages. The problem is that if we're coming from a European language, in the first place, the structure is very different from European structure, and if we try to describe it in terms of European structure, which the textbooks do, then we're going to become very confused. It's like trying to describe chess in the terminology of football. It doesn't work very well. Kanji certainly take some learning, but they're not as big a barrier as people tend to think. Actually, the largest barrier is vocabulary. This is the case in any language. Acquiring sufficient vocabulary is probably the major task. Now, in Japanese, this is not as easy as it is in European languages if you're starting out from a European language, because European language is Western. European languages have an awful lot of vocabulary in common. If you go to a country where you don't know the language at all, such as, say, Italy, if you don't know any Italian at all, you can probably get a general idea of what the newspaper headlines are talking about just because of their sheer volume of common European vocabulary. Words that you may not exactly know, but you know that they're close enough to words you know in English or French that you have a pretty good idea what they're talking about. In Japanese, when you start Japanese from the beginning, you have no friends at all in terms of vocabulary, except for words borrowed into Japanese from English and other European languages. Now, in absolute terms, there are quite a lot of these, but as a percentage of the language, they're very small. But even more than this, Japanese has a lot more words than English or other European languages. If you look at a comparable dictionary of English and Japanese, the Japanese dictionary has a lot more words in it. Now, why is this? It's, again, because of the way that we try to treat Japanese as if it were a European language. So we're applying the European notion of a word to Japanese. The fact is that Japanese has words for all kinds of things that English doesn't have a word for, but uses a phrase for. For example, in Japanese, there are words for things like goods returned to the shop, a dog I'm very fond of, taking a bath. All of these in English are phrases. In Japanese, there are words for them. Generally speaking, words made up of two kanji. Now, a learner of English doesn't have to learn all these phrases. You may never have heard the expression, goods returned to the shop, or a dog I'm very fond of. But if you know the words involved and you know the grammar, you don't actually have to memorize each of these phrases as a separate thing to learn. And exactly the same thing is true of Japanese. Although these expressions are called words and are listed in a dictionary as words, they're actually somewhere between what we would call a word in English and what we would call a phrase in English. And just as with a phrase, we don't necessarily need to know every single one, so long as we know the parts that make it up. So, let's take the example of a dog I'm very fond of. In Japanese, this is ai ken. Ai is the kanji for love. Ken is the standard on-reading of the kanji for inu, dog. So ai ken means love, dog. Dog I love, dog I'm very fond of. Ai sha, ai again is the kanji for love. Sha is the on-reading of the kanji for kuruma, car. So ai sha is car I love. Shinpin is new goods. Shin is the on-reading of the kanji that we find in atarashii, new. And hin or pin is the standard on-reading of shina, goods. So shinpin means new goods as opposed to second-hand goods. Shinsha, we have the on reading of the kanji for new again, and the on reading of the kanji for kuruma. So shinsha is a new car. Henpin, hen is the on reading of the kanji we find in kaesu, to return something, and pin again is the on reading of shina, goods. So henpin is returned goods, goods returned to the place they came from, to the shop. So you can see the pattern here. Really what's happening is pretty much the same as what happens in English. Once we are familiar with the on readings of the kanji concerned, and in most cases they have one main on reading. In a few of the more widely used ones they may have two. Occasionally they have more, but we don't need to start looking at some of the long lists of on readings that we see in some dictionaries, because most of them are either only used in names or only used in a few cases. Generally speaking, what we need to know is the main on reading of a particular kanji, and that's the one we'll be dealing with most of the time. And the point about this is that we can very quickly learn how to do this on the fly. For example, some time ago I heard the word temme, which means the name of a store. Tem is the on reading of the kanji for mise, a shop or store, and me is one of the two main on readings of na, the na of namae, name, which is sometimes me and sometimes myo. When I heard the expression temme in context, even though I'd never heard it before, it was clear to me what it meant. Ten, shop, me, name, temme. So, temme is in fact no more difficult than the name of the shop in English. It's made up of those two elements, and that kind of combining of two kanji into a phrase-like word or a word-like phrase is standard Japanese practice. So even though Japanese has more words than English, in fact, it's not really more difficult than English, and in some ways it's actually easier, because this kanji combining technique helps to create some of the words that in English would in fact be a completely different word, but in Japanese we can break down the kanji structure in our minds and see what it means. Now this doesn't just apply to two kanji words. Sometimes there are more than two kanji, and sometimes a two kanji word can take another kanji or two more kanji to build it into something more specific. For example, kaisui is seawater. Kai is the standard on reading of umi, beach or sea. Sui is the standard on reading of mizu, water. Together, kai sui is sea water. Now, from here we find words or expressions like kai sui on. Kai sui, as we know, means seawater, and on is the regular on reading of the kanji we find in atatakai, warm, and it's that form of atatakai which generally means something warm rather than, say, warm weather. It's the on that we find in onsen, hot spring. So kai sui on is the warmth of seawater or the seawater temperature. Kai sui gyo, gyo is the on reading of sakana, fish. So kai sui gyo is seawater fish. Kai sui yoku, yoku is the kanji we find in abiru, bathe. So kai sui yoku means seawater bathing. And from just the elements we've talked about here, we can find various other combinations, such as nin-gyo, which means a mermaid. Nin, one of the two main readings of Hito, which is either Jin or Nin. So Nin Gyo, mermaid, person, fish. Gyo Sen, Sen is the standard on reading of Fune, ship or boat. So Gyo Sen is a fishing boat. New Yoku, new is the standard on reading of the kanji we find in Hairu, enter. So New Yoku is take a bath, get in the bath. New Gaku is to enter school. It usually means to start a new school. New in means in this case a hospital, means an institution or originally a temple. New in means enter the institution, which in this case is understood to be a byoin, a hospital, an institution for sickness or sick people. New in is to go into the hospital or to be hospitalized. So I think we can start to see, even though Japanese appears to have all these specialized words, the way it works is not actually very different from English. Once we get used to the kanji and their on-readings, which are usually very limited and manageable in number, usually just one main one, sometimes two, we're going to get used to seeing them, and we're going to get used to hearing them, and by a combination of sounds whose meaning we know, kanji whose meaning we know, and context, we can understand these compounded words very easily and very regularly. I think the trick that helps us to do that is to stop thinking of them as words in the English sense, that's to say, as completely new learning jobs, completely different sound structures that have a new meaning. They're just as much phrases as they are words. And when we get used to seeing them that way and hearing them that way, we're in a much better position to pick up vocabulary smoothly and quickly. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. You can see a list of my red Kokeshi patrons in the information section below. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.